Hello, everyone. Welcome to our group's presentation on the book, Preparing to Teach Social Studies for Social Justice. My name is Becca, and my group mates are Rivers, Alex, and Scott. I'll be starting us off with a bit of an introduction to the book. Authors Ruchi Agarwal, Ranganath, Allison Dover, and Nick Henning really make a point of taking a narrative approach to their book through their collection of 20 letters from 20 different teachers from whom they share advice and personal experiences in teaching for social justice-based pedagogies and curriculums for the benefit of teachers new to the profession. They address the relationship between the standardization of public education and accountability-driven measurements, which, quote, may force teachers to negotiate what and how they want to teach, unquote. They critique Common Core's, quote, alignment to state-adopted textbooks and high-stakes standardized tests, which resulted in a dominant pattern of social studies instruction characterized by text-oriented, whole-group, teacher-centered approaches aimed toward the transmission of factual information, unquote. In response, they outline 3 justice-oriented conceptual approaches to Common Core. The first strategy is to embrace, which views Common Core as offering teachers more flexibility in terms of requirements and material covered. In this way, teachers can pursue student-centered curriculum that emphasizes critical thinking in ways that check off Common Core specifications. The second is reframing or redefining curriculum to, quote, subvert dominant curricular and pedagogical paradigms by recentering issues of equity, social location, and justice, unquote. As one social studies teacher, Brian Gibbs, acknowledges, rebuilding an entirely new system from scratch is difficult and extremely complex. Therefore, teachers who choose to reframe curriculum subtly, as he puts it, through whispered conversation in the hallway, the lunchtime spent talking and planning, the lesson or unit shared, can often make more headway than frustrated denouncements of the department can. Reclaiming professional expertise is also an aspect addressed in this strategy. Lastly, the authors address resistance to recent curricular shifts. These teachers choose to resist the high-stakes testing and accountability policies as unjust and question who stands to benefit. They point out the discrepancies in Common Core, which gloss over social studies skills, which would work against the deconstructualization and depersonalization of history and the study of human beings. Furthermore, in the following 2 parts of the book, the authors examine the ways teachers have translated their passions and theories around social justice into praxis, or their practical curricular and pedagogical practices. They reframe Common Core's critical disciplinary literacy into a jumping off point for the analysis of significant social studies concepts and look at teaching thematically. Learning to teach for social justice is an act of becoming, they write. Essentially, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes resources, allies, mentors, community, and an open mind. They acknowledge social studies as especially susceptible to the political climate, but that schools are not neutral or objective places to begin with. In their conclusion, the authors encourage teacher and student agency, the reframing of accountability mandates, collective action for social justice, and to resist passivity and compliance.
All right. So the book definitely begins with a recognition that the measurable effect of curriculum is an important part of our educational system today, that we will be entering into a teaching environment that contains the Common Core state standards, and that it's very important to recognize as a social justice educator that the Common Core state standards and the standards that you may be judged by are not the standards you may wish to be judged by or judge your students by. Common Core state standards do leave some room for interpretation, as I believe Scott will talk about.
Yeah, so one big thing that it talks about in the book, and I think that we've talked about in our classes, and even talked about today when Roscoe Karen and the other representative, Jerry Lewis, I want to say, came and talked to our class and said, being a first-year teacher is remarkably challenging. And a lot of teachers come in with a lot of really positive intent and a lot of, ideas of how that they can make positive progress, but don't enter the profession with the tools, respect given to them, or the, ability and focus and like understanding to make the difference that they want to see, which is unfortunate, but this book gives a lot of like strategies to overcome that. One thing that it talks about first-year student or first-year teachers facing is the Common Core Social Studies curriculum, or math curriculum, or whatever curriculum fits with your subject. And it talks about in the book how there's been so many educational policies that have changed over the past 10, 20 years, and there's a constant revolving door with new implementations, new understandings, new interpretations of the different educational policies that are going on. So you're ultimately, and one thing that's kind of found in a lot of these policies is the ability to kind of like interpret it in your own way and interpret it in your own context. So it's important to keep in mind that like while there are these guiding principles and these standards that we're held to, in this case Common Core, maybe tomorrow or the day after there's going to be these other policies that we also have to fight against, fight within, and fight through, and use to support our teaching. And yeah, even though we're facing something today, we'll be facing something new in the future.
All right. The social justice education throughout the book has some foundational principles. I picked a definition on page 70 that I thought was particularly germane. Student-centered and multicultural is how they choose to define social justice education, and that teachers need to respect students' abilities, interests, and opinions, and encourage students to make connections between themselves and the curriculum. This definition of social justice education is very important to how all 20 of the teachers interact with how they present their education.
So as Rivers talked about, it's important to be student-centered and multicultural in order to implement, social studies curriculum, or not social studies, social justice curriculum, and being a social justice renegade. And one way to do that is through focusing on critical literacy. Critical literacy is basically the idea, of asking whose voice is being heard, whose voice is being excluded, what were the circumstances that were going on at this time. So whether you're reading, a source document from the 1800s, or whether you're reading a textbook written 10 years ago talking about the 1800s, you can still be asking yourself, who wrote this? What was their vested interest? Where is this coming from? Is this, curriculum out of Texas? Is this curriculum out of Oregon? Like either way, there's going to be biases, there's going to be issues, and there's going to be challenges. And looking at it from, trying to pull in as big a multicultural lens as opposed to monocultural lens is an approach that allows you to view things through a lens of cultural literacy or critical literacy. And then I have a little video from Chimamanda, I got it. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie about the dangers of a single story.
The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story.
Cool. And then the other part that Rivers talked about is being student-centered. And one thing that I know, everyone in this group has their ideas of how they want to be a better teacher. I know I have my ideas of how I want to be an effective teacher. But one voice that oftentimes gets left out is that of the students, and thinking, what is the student's perspective? What are they interested in? And giving them experiential learning opportunities, as long as it's done in a, framed and done in a promoting context and a culturally sensitive context, which Alexander will talk about shortly. It can be a really effective strategy to have students' voices elevated and promoted. But the one caveat of that is it's really contingent on having a, you know, safe/brave or as brave as space as possible in your classroom to be able to promote these different ideas. And if you aren't able to work with your students and creating a brave space, then a lot of these experiential opportunities kind of cease to exist.
So a lot of these concepts of student-centered learning, multicultural learning, and specifically critical education, critical pedagogy, and critical conscience come from the shoulders of Paulo Freire. Two explicit examples I pulled from the text are here on the screen, but particularly that students are hungering to understand the world that they live in, that education necessarily takes place in a point in time and in a place in the world, and that there's no escaping that students need to be able to critically read and understand the perspectives that are offered in a multicultural social justice education. And then that process of including the students is the only way to have a social justice education that is not oppressive. Capitalizing on that, learning as becoming is heavily referenced throughout the book. I have been very interested in empathy and vicarious learning, particularly in the frame of social science education. I think this quote from page 17, talking about perspective taking and teaching a student about history and the bias in perspectives, is an important part to framing social justice education and allowing our students to understand the world that they live in. But understanding the world that they live in is not necessarily enough. Learning about the racism, classism, and genocidal past doesn't provide them the skills to change the world around them. Providing them the skills of power and empowerment so that they may recognize their own power and their own possibilities can help them to become, specifically to become social justice activists and people that can positively impact the world around them and the community which we share. To get away from students a little, learning to teach social justice is also an act of becoming. As teachers, we will improve, we will gain allies, and we will make mistakes. We have to understand that to teach social justice is to become better every day, to constantly interrogate your curriculum and your pedagogy to make sure that it is uplifting all students. Considering curriculum as discipline expertise, I think is a congruent way to approach history with social justice. Historians are asked to interrogate history, to understand which facts and which contexts are the most reasonable view of history. When social studies is constructed as the memorization of facts, or what Paulo Freire would call the banking school of education, then the essence to what it means to be a historian is lost. Investigating history as historians do is far more complex, and it's important that we bring our children and our students to be able to interrogate history and learn vicariously.
All right, so yeah, let's take a look at like what pieces of the book that you should read if you ever get a chance to. And let's start kind of back here at chapter 2 with some of the conceptual approaches of the Common Core that I outlined in the beginning. And just to reiterate, to embrace the Common Core is you're seeing the Common Core as having increased critical flexibility to include social justice. If you're reframing it, you're subverting the Common Core state standards and you're recentering social justice as part of the curriculum. And if you're resisting, you're questioning the Common Core and you're actively working to affect social justice curriculum from these kind of interventions of corporate education reforms. So that chapter goes into depth about what those mean. But important too, in chapter 6, Becoming a Renegade, they have a section on examining your stance. And your stance is your conceptual approach, and it's how you are within the school and within your community. And it's important to examine your context. What is your school? What is your school district? How supportive is your educational community of what stance you want to take? Because it's not just what you think ideologically or in terms of pedagogy, what should be happening. There's real world contexts that you need to keep in mind to help your survival, because this book does emphasize that in your first few years of teaching, it's hard. This is difficult stuff, and these are some strategies to keep yourself surviving in the field. So, and the next slide. And if we go to chapter 4, it answers kind of that question of what will I actually teach, which is like at the forefront of our minds. What am I actually going to put in front of students? And it provides a lot of question banks and checklists for you as a teacher to either interrogate your curriculum or your questions that students should be using for critical literacy. It goes into document-based questions and essential questions. But I included here this kind of question bank of, so how do you decide what to teach? Because that is kind of the starting point for a lot of us. I also want to emphasize the transformative curriculum checklist on page 62. That really helps you interrogate your curriculum and ask yourself if you're positioning anything along a social justice lens. And the next slide. Didn't want to leave with, without being a little critical of the text. So there are a couple points in here that I thought might be problematic or that we should question. So Scott mentioned experientials and simulations earlier and how we get students to engage the text. But there is this line that stuck out to me of, I want history to be done to the students so they experience it. And there are lots of things I don't want in history done to anybody. So how are there places where simulations and experientials are problematic? How are they effective? I mean, obviously there's a big piece of engagement there, but that's kind of a question to keep in our minds when we're moving through some of this content. And another line of kind of in the same vein here, Laura feels she must also remember that they are young people at an age where they deserve and need to be emotionally protected. And that's true. Our classrooms need to be places where students feel safe. But how does that align with our earlier conversations about safe and brave spaces and how brave of a space we need to have in our classroom to effectively have these conversations? So maybe not criticism, but just like things to keep in mind when approaching this text and approaching this subject. So that's all that we have. We found this text to be incredibly inspirational and hopeful, because this is a very difficult part of our future teaching. How do we work in a framework that we don't find immediately conducive to social justice, right? And this provides a lot of concrete narrative-based kind of teacher examples of just how to do that. So yeah, if you can pick it up, if you're going to be teaching social studies, it's a good read. And yeah, thank you all for watching.